Good morning. This is the Larchmont Mamaroneck Summit. Our talk today is on nuclear energy and specifically Indian Point and the issues that are associated with its relicensing. Our speakers today are from a broad group. First of all, we have Professor Nir Ashari, who's an MIT graduate, who's currently a professor at Yeshiva University in New York, and he will be here to talk about nuclear energy in a generic sense, as well as the recent difficulties in Japan and the relationship of the Japanese problems to Indian Point here in Westchester County. Our second speaker will be Philip Musagas, a lawyer with Riverkeeper, and he is the director of the Hudson River Affairs and is working closely on the relicensing of Indian Point. As a program director, Philip manages a staff of attorneys and investigators whose mission is to safeguard the ecological integrity of the Hudson River. He is also the lead attorney representing Riverkeeper on its intervention in the Indian Point license renewal proceedings. Our third speaker is John Durso, who is the executive director of the Alliance for Reliable and Affordable Electricity. His organization, the acronym for which is New York Area, is a diverse coalition of more than 150 businesses, labor unions, independent energy experts, and community and environmental leaders. Its primary mission is to educate both the general public and the federal, state, and local policymakers about New York's energy supply challenges while offering solutions designed to satisfy New York's growing demand for reliable and affordable electric power. Let's start with Professor Ashari. Nir, will you please lead off?
New York State not only does not have a plan to replace Indian Point, but even if they did want to replace it, there is no viable option to expedite that process. And even if we were going to replace that power, where are we going to put those power plants? We're here in Mamaroneck and Larchmont. Are all of you willing to have a large gas-fired plant put right in your community? Where else can we put it? As we all know, if you're going to actually put that power in there to replace it, it's got to be close to the source where you're using it. So where are we going to put it? It creates a number of different options. But in terms, and there's going to be a number of different questions. We believe respectfully that Indian Point is an important source of clean power that creates jobs, keeps our infrastructure moving, and supports our economic recovery. We believe it is safe, we believe it is effective, and we believe it must remain online and be relicensed. Look forward to your questions. Thank you again for the opportunity, and thank again Nir, Philip, and all of you for your attention, and look forward to your questions. So thank you very much.
John, thank you very much. Very elucidating. I'd like to thank the entire panel. We have, fortunately, a lot of leftover time here, and I'm going to, shall I designate who asks questions?
Or whoever asks the question.
Yes, Carol.
It just so happens that during that test that you just mentioned for Indian Point's sirens, I happened to be on a golf course within that radius, and I was with people that live up there, and we're in the middle of the golf course. These sirens go off. It's blaring. It's an odd time. It was like 10:24 or something like that. It was a strange time. And I kept saying to the people with me, how do you know that this isn't a real disaster? And I said, did they have something in the paper? Did you know? They said, no, this goes off all the time. So now we're at the point where the people that actually live within the 10-mile radius it's like crying wolf. They don't know if it's a real disaster, not a real disaster. They have gotten to the point where they're like, oh, those sirens go off all the time, just ignore them. So I think that's a real issue. You know, and that's something that I don't know if you could bring back to whoever you guys are connected with, but something that you ought to think about. And the other thing, I just want to ask a question, which is, I've heard all sorts of numbers about how much power is generated by that plant and what it really means to us downstate. And I just wondered, you know, there's been numbers in the paper everywhere from 5% to 25%. What is the real number, and does it really make that a big difference for us? And if you could, whoever wants to address that.
John?
Maybe we each answer.
Yeah, we can both. Yeah, we both should. Well, here's what I'm going to say first, Carol, just in talking about sirens. I know they have the quarterly tests, and I know they are announced. I know the media has covered that. I know you'll see it on News 12. Sometimes you'll see it at the bottom of the screen. I don't think anyone would disagree with the fact that more can be done to communicate with the public. I don't think anyone can say that. Where have I got my numbers? And Philip and I are going to have a disagreement, I'm sure, on this, but our numbers have come through the independent system operator, which is the operator of the grid. These numbers have actually been reported within the Journal News itself. I think Greg Clary had a story about this. I think it was about, we're in May now, so I think this was back in March. And it was actually, ironically, it was a story that came out right before Fukushima happened. I think actually it was the same week. It may have been the Sunday right before it occurred. But I'm looking in terms of the independent system operator, which is NISO, I believe, .org. Many of you can see some of the reports itself. They've consistently called for the fact that if you're going to take Indian Point offline, they say that you are going to have a quote-unquote gross violation of reliability standards for the grid. Now, yeah, and with that, Phil, I'll just turn to you. Yeah, I could keep going, but chance.
I think, can everyone hear me without the microphone?
Speak loud.
Speak louder, okay. So I think there are a lot of different numbers out there, as you said. And I'll just quickly touch on the range. So a lot of people now are saying, well, it's only 5% of the power. Based on what we know, we don't agree with that. I think that the 5% number comes from the public contracts that Entergy has with the New York Power Authority and with Con Edison. Because Entergy's licenses are getting close to their expiration, the amount of power that they buy under these set contracts is going down towards the end of their license. That doesn't mean that Entergy doesn't. What they do is sell a lot of their power in the open power market through the system operator every day. And since a lot of the power demand is downstate, a lot of their power still goes downstate. I think the points being made by this 5% is that the claim that Entergy makes that they provide 30 to 40% of the power. I think we would like to see the number, the actual information to back that up, and there are not contracts to back it up, so it's very hard to challenge. What Riverkeeper says is slightly different. I don't know if it's even a disagreement so much, but it's slightly different. We use a number of about 12.5%, and that is the percentage of power that Indian Point supplies to downstate New York during the peak demand time in the summertime. And the time when the reliability of the electrical grid is most important, and when you have to make sure that you have enough electricity on hand, is in the middle of August when it's 95 degrees. We're all running our air conditioners, and the peak demand skyrockets. I think it's 33,000 megawatts statewide in peak summertime. During that peak demand, in downstate New York, the amount of power demand is roughly, I think, 15 to 17,000 megawatts. That's New York City, Westchester, part of Long Island. So Indian Point's 2,000 megawatts supplies roughly 12% of that. So we like to use that number because I think when we need the power the most, that's the number it supplies. So it's not 25 or 30 or 40%. And I could go on to, I don't want to go on too long. Just one comment about that John made about the, if we shut down Indian Point, what do we do to replace it? And I certainly agree we need to have a plan to replace it. Governor Cuomo has not done enough to take steps to replace Indian Point. But there are several new power projects going online. that will make up a lot of that power. There's a 1,000 megawatt power cable being proposed that would bring hydropower from Canada down to New York City. It's a direct transmission line, so it does not have any transmission problems. It doesn't. It's basically power, especially from New York City. So that theoretically, if that's permitted and that goes online in the next 3 to 4 years, that would replace one of the reactors. There is another project with an electrical cable being brought in from the New Jersey grid into New York City. It's called the Cross Hudson Cable. That's, I believe, another 660 megawatts that's going online in the next 1 to 2 years. So there are new power projects being proposed and being built, being permitted, that will provide additional resources. We're not talking about coal power plants. We're not talking about a natural gas plant in Mamaroneck, where there are other solutions that we can bring. So I don't want to belabor it.
Can I make a follow-up comment? Because I have no stake either way, Carol, on both of your points. First of all, what did your friends do when they heard this? What did your friends do when they heard the siren? They called someone?
They ignored it.
Okay.
Completely. They didn't even check.
Then there's personal responsibility there. That's not Riverkeeper, that's not New York area. You have to pick up the phone and say, what's going on? I mean, I see that in my own university. When I smell smoke, there are certain faculty who will call and say, hey, I smell smoke, what's going on? And other people say, you know, I have a lab with chemicals. When I smell smoke, I get alarmed. But not, respect, not fear. So there's an issue of personal responsibility. When, if I heard a siren in Westchester, I would be, because I never hear it. Also, I'm not here that often anymore, but still, even if I were in New York City. So that's point number one.
It did scare me to death.
No, did you call someone?
I said, can't we call somebody?
Oh,
and
good.
they didn't want to call anybody.
Yeah.
I, on the other hand, knew it was going to happen because I got a phone call and I didn't hear it. I was waiting
I'm not saying
for it.
it's perfect, but we all have to take some personal responsibility. Then I want to address your point about figures. When preparing for this talk, I tried to get, it wasn't so much of the percentage of power, where I think John and Phil clarified that, but in terms of what's going to happen with the cost, which is the point taken offline. And the answer is, I couldn't find a number that I could believe, because the figures go so wildly. In fact, there's a 2006 National Academy of Science report asking what would happen about, if Indian Point were taken offline. And it's interesting, by the way, that both the New York area and Riverkeeper quote from that report to support their position. That we can talk about that maybe privately. But the thing is that even the National Academy of Sciences, there's just too many factors, they can't estimate it. So obviously one other issue that has to be addressed is maybe a better in-depth study and like what would be the consequences in terms of cost. I mean, on one hand, John, I think you said 200%.
150.
150, and I think on your website like 10%.
I think there was a recent report that was on CNN Money, which again, if you see things in the newspaper, doesn't mean they're true, but I think it said closer to 5 to 6%.
5 or 6%. So
there's
that's a big gap, and I think we should do more work to narrow that gap. So that's it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Question. Is there at Indian Point or any other nuclear reactor in the United States, is there an element of private investment which may lead to private profit in any way,
Repeat the question.
And use the mic, we've got other sounds coming in back here.
No. Let me just make sure I understand the question right. Is there private investment that's going on at the plant which would bring about profit? Okay. The operator of Indian Point is Entergy. They're a private company. Okay. I can't speak to their profits. I can't speak to any of those operations. But what I can tell you as a relation, in 2008, the company had done an evaluation of the plant. It's called the Independent Safety Evaluation. And they hired a number of experts, one of whom was John Dyson, who was just appointed actually by Governor Cuomo onto the New York State Power Authority. And they looked at the plant, they looked at the operations, they looked at what needed to be done. And in this report, they outlined a number of different actions that the plant could take to ensure that the plant continues to be safe and effective for years to come. As part of this plan, as a result, Entergy made an agreement that they were going to invest more than $600 million. That's more than $500 million into the infrastructure of the plant to keep it as a first-class facility, and they have been doing that. I think you can see it right around the facility itself. Candidly, I've been to the White House, and I'm sure some of you here have probably done the same. You go to Indian Point, candidly, I find it to be even more secure than the White House. You can't go 10 feet without someone either demanding an ID or somebody there with a gun just to make sure that everyone, should be there, is there, and it's not. But I would also say to all of you, as a potential trip one day, all of you should go and see the plant for yourself. They actually do group tours at the plant. And I would encourage you all to go up there and see the plant itself. Ask the questions, demand the answers. And I am confident that all of you will be very, very satisfied with what you see.
Sol Energy's a public company, and it owns the facilities. They have a 10K report which gives a lot of information about their nuclear and wholesale operations. Yes, Keith?
This is Professor Ashery. Outside of nuclear power plants, what other form of nuclear energy is used? How is it being used?
So you have it, of course, in...
Could you use the microphone?
Sorry. Yeah, sure. Okay, so the question was, outside of nuclear power plants, how is nuclear energy used? We still work on weapons. We have that there. That's not a good thing. We should reduce that. We and all the other nuclear powers should reduce that. So that's point number one. It's also used in military application. Submarines are powered through nuclear energy. There is also another form of nuclear energy I should mention that is not when you split the atom, but when you bring atoms together. That's how the sun works. And they've been working on that much cleaner form of, it's still nuclear because it involves nuclei, but doesn't have the problems of fission, the splitting. Unfortunately, it's not yet in any remotely commercially viable stage, but that's still in, I'd say, in the research stage, but that's being worked. And then, they're sometimes used in detectors and other things, nuclear, but that's much small, very small use. And the medical, of course, medical devices use nuclear isotopes. In fact, that's one of the problems we're actually facing. We don't have enough of specific radioactive elements for nuclear diagnostics. We're running short precisely because we're not making enough of them in nuclear reactors. So those are, but again, that's a question, do we want to make that trade-off? Fewer isotopes for less power.
Yes, sir.
Well, thanks for a great presentation. Public service really, it seems to me, would best be served by finding a solution to this problem. You both presented the usual, we think this is right, we do think that's right, and the puppet is left saying, which is right, gosh, and it's clear it's not safety at any cost. We can't live that way. We have to find some intermediate ground and do better on the safety, that's quite clear. We can't take your word that everything's fine, it certainly isn't. Can't you guys and other organizations get together and, instead of having an adversarial approach to this problem, form some sort of a citizens commission to move us ahead? Really, the public sector and the private sector aren't going to be the leaders in this. We're the nonprofits. Can't you do something different than give us 2 points of view? And I appreciate it.
Let me add a footnote to that question, and that is storage of nuclear waste. It's my understanding that the federal government is obligated to create a receptacle for nuclear waste. And of course, the federal government hasn't done jack about it. Excuse the language. Now, this was supposed to be done in Nevada, but there's a certain senator from Nevada that won't have any part of it, which is understandable. Not in my backyard, but it's a real issue for everybody. And until you have that, you're going to have it in your backyard.
Just a quick response. That's a great point. I think it's difficult for us to find common ground because Entergy is a private company. It's operating a deregulated electricity market, and its responsibility basically is to its shareholders to make profits and to return those profits to its shareholders. And so, like any good business, and I'm not saying this as an anti-corporation thing or anything, but any good business, is going to minimize their costs as much as possible while not taking too many risks and trying to make the most money for the people that support them. And so, I think we have tried in the past to find common ground. We had a settlement on environmental issues with Con Edison when they owned the Indian Point back in the late 1970s. That agreement basically to allow Indian Point to keep damaging the Hudson River ecosystem in return for not building the Storm King power plant. This goes way back to the early 70s. That was based on the idea that then the company would go in and upgrade its cooling system and protect the environment. Con Edison basically refused to do that, and Entergy has refused to do that, and because it costs money and it's expensive. And so, I agree. We need to find common ground. I think, I think we would be in a much different situation if we had a better operator back with Con Edison and also with Entergy that was more willing to invest. And I know they've invested some money in the plant. We think, frankly, they should invest more. And so, this is probably not the answer you were looking for, but it's. It's tough to find common ground. We would welcome it, but.
Candidly, from New York area's perspective, we want to work with the community. We will work with any stakeholder to make sure not only that the facility is operating, but is safe and continues to provide the benefits. We're going to have a genuine fundamental disagreement on that. It's not personal. It's just what we believe, what other organizations believe. But I would also turn, there was something that Nir said before that really struck me when we're talking about the concept of respect versus fear. Okay? It makes me think, my father-in-law is a retired pilot, and he always talks, his greatest joy is being up in the air, okay, for the peace that it brings about, just being able to look at everything, just to take a nice ride around the New York area, go out to Pennsylvania. But he always made it a point of saying to respect the air. You'd rather be on the ground looking up than the other way around, okay? And it also makes me think about what had happened with Fukushima, and we're talking about nuclear energy. If an accident happened with a plane, we saw a plane that ended up going down to JFK, let's say a 727 went down. We're going to take a responsible approach. We're going to, the airline itself will probably ground that entire fleet to make sure that the tests are done, to make sure that everything checks out, and they're going to ask to see what can be done to make sure this doesn't happen in the future. We don't ground the entire industry. We don't ground everything. We take a very measured and responsible approach on a case-by-case basis. What you would see within the nuclear industry itself is taking an approach, learning the lessons, to see what is going to come out. And there are still, as they said before, there are a number of things that we still have to learn as to what happened at Fukushima. But what I'm going to say from my end is I have complete confidence, and again, this is me, and you know what, it's going to bear itself out in time. But I have complete confidence that the industry itself, in particular at Indian Point, they're going to learn the lessons of what went wrong at Indian Point. And I bet you that is not going to happen here in New York. It's not going to happen here in this country.
Yes, ma'am.
This sort of may seem like an unimportant issue. Remind me, what was the year when 3 Mile Harbor happened?
3 Mile.
79. What year was it?
79.
79. Right. In the early
No,
80s,
it was 1979.
and a lot of disaster plans began to be developed from the national level. At that time, I was when the concept was still fairly new, I was in charge of developing emergency medical services in Westchester County. And the job that was given to me was to develop an evacuation plan in case anything happened at Indian Point. We spent hours and hours on it. All I can tell you, when we got through and realized it was a futile plan, it would never have really been effective. And I don't know whether anything has improved since then, but the evacuation was just awful, partially because most of our lines of communication are this way and very little that way. and there's just no, it just wouldn't have worked.
I would like to ask about, we haven't brought up the fact that alternative possibilities of energy plans, including efficiency. I've heard studies that say we could save 20% of our efforts for the nuclear, and if we did more with efficiency, like just in general savings, whether it's hanging the clothes on the clothesline. That's a bit much, I know, but there have been studies about this. And then just the concept of where we possibly, does this not mean, is there not more incentive to try with solar, to try with wind, to see what the other possibilities are? I haven't heard much from this, end of things. I would just like to have that addressed.
I think that's a great comment, and I think we'll all probably agree on a lot of this, and this is an area where we can find common ground. There's tremendous potential for increased energy efficiency, and especially in New York City and downstate New York. Natural Resources Defense Council, which is an international environmental group, but they have a whole team of very good people who work on energy issues. They estimate in New York State that if they implemented real energy efficiency measures at the state level, they could save 30%. They could reduce energy demand by 30% in 5 years. And a lot of this energy policy that we talk about, it really comes from the state level on down. And so that's why when I mentioned Governor Cuomo earlier, I think it's really important that, if you're concerned about Indian Point, if you believe if you believe it should stay open, should close, whether Indian Point operates or not, we need a better energy policy for New York State. And energy efficiency is a great point. You mentioned solar power. Solar power is part of what energy people call distributed generation, which just means instead of relying so much on big, large power plants like Indian Point and like some of the big power plants in New York City, you start to have smaller sources of generation that are like rooftop solar panels on buildings. We have a tidal turbine project in the East River in New York City, which is going to generate electricity. It's basically like an underwater wind tower. They're doing a pilot project off of Roosevelt Island, and it's already powering a part of Roosevelt Island with this pilot project. They would like to put about 30 more turbines in the river because there's this huge tidal exchanging current that generates power. It basically turns the turbines underwater. So there's potential for other kinds of renewable power. As photovoltaic and solar technology gets cheaper and easier to produce, that can be distributed more widely. Just to remind people, one of the biggest kind of sources of wasted energy comes from buildings, comes from homes and office buildings. And so New York City, there's tremendous potential to lower energy use if you just retrofit existing buildings. If you put green roofs on buildings, that lowers the temperature in the city, that helps with other forms of pollution. There are so many things that we can do that don't require building large new power plants that can reduce the demand, and whether Indian Point keeps running or not, can reduce our dependence on nuclear energy, on coal, on all these things. So.
Thank you, Phil. And actually, just to piggyback off of what Philip had said, I would say, from our perspective, we probably agree with about 95% of that. The fact of the matter is that while we can't, in our opinion, while you can't take Indian Point offline in lieu of solar and conservation, it does not diminish the fact that we absolutely must be investing further in renewable sources of energy like solar, like wind, like geothermal, and the list can go on and on. We want to make sure that you also see additional hydropower. Hydropower is clean as well. It emits no carbon emissions. It's very, very important. The issues that come down, and actually before we even go into that, Mayor Bloomberg just came out with his revised Plan NYC, which is an internationally modeled blueprint for encouraging sustainability. He's doing it within New York City. He has solar-powered chargers for vehicles that's taken place outside in Brooklyn. He wants to put solar panels within landfills, look at landfill energy. Here's where we come down to and where the problem comes, and particularly with wind, is you will see great opposition from many communities to actually expanding wind. We all see the need for wind. I'll give you one example and I'll turn it right back. I came from Rochester, New York, just upstate. I had spent some time up there. New York Power Authority has been trying to site a wind farm all throughout that region, along Lake Ontario, going probably, I would say, maybe about Oswego over towards Niagara. You've seen incredible community opposition. There is a proposal between LIPA as well as Con Edison to build a wind farm off the coast of the Rockaways, which again, this could provide up to 700 megawatts of power during peak use when the wind is actually blowing. And again, you're seeing community opposition. It comes down to one of the reasons why we need a power plant siting law, to actually expedite and make sure that you do have the intervenor funding, but to get these sources of power up online, and that includes renewables. So we'll leave it at that.
I'd like I'd just like to add to that something. So I think that the idea of conservation is important, and what Phil mentioned in terms of efficiency, it's huge, and he's absolutely right that buildings is a big source. But I want to point out the tone of this discussion. We're all looking for external solutions to the problem. We're saying, well, when the technology will come in, we'll do this, and the solar cells, what are we doing in our own lives to conserve energy? I'm going to ask a very simple question. How many households here have more than one car? How many households have more than one car? Would you be willing to give up one of those cars for the environment? You know, easy to point at the industry and technology, but what are we doing? I'm not, I bought a huge display for my Mac because I like it. It's incredibly wasteful. I want to point out, by the way, my mother, who's in the audience, keeps the house at something like 66 degrees Fahrenheit.
65.
65 in the winter. Icicles grow on my nose. I get pneumonia every winter, but it's an effort to conserve. And, that's what she says. That's exactly. Or the worst, I'm not cold. How do you argue with that? I'm not cold. So we're all looking for external answers, but there are things we can all do right now to help the energy problem. And so we have to think about that as well.
Susan?
I've alluded to it a little bit, but I'd like to know why we aren't doing anything about nuclear fusion, which is the clean one.
I think you mean, nuclear fusion. So just the question, Susan? Yeah, the question from Susan is, why aren't we doing things about nuclear fusion, the way the sun makes energy by bringing atoms together. It sounds nicer, right? Well, we can't do it exactly the way the sun does because the sun has this advantage of its huge mass that lets gravity do the work. There are two approaches to that. One is to confine them, different forms of hydrogen, and to bring them in a magnetic field and collide them and see if they form fusion. And there is a big reactor being built in the south of France, ITER. I think the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, to try to move it a little bit closer to feasibility. There is still also what's called inertial fusion, where you take pellets and you shine lasers on them and squish them together really hard and hope you get energy. But again, it's working, the research is there, but we're still too far from any commercial applications. Hopefully, that we will see it, but I mean, it won't be in the next 10 or 20 years for sure. But it's an avenue to pursue.
Yes, sir, back there.
If an evacuation exercise was activated now, how would we know it? Would the siren go off and as the Carol series, of course, where will we go?
The question relates to the evacuation plan and brief summary.
Very briefly, and I'm going to defer right to the emergency planners on this, but this is what I do know and what I'm very confident to tell you. There will be an immediate notice given to the public, which will be carried by TV, carried by radio. The emergency broadcasting network will be utilized. You will see this the thing right at the bottom of your screen. In the areas within the zone, the sirens will go off. And also in many of the centers, it's also as part of community newspapers, there is the plan that is actually put out. It's going to tell you what bus stop that you're going to actually board on, what is going to actually happen within your community. This was actually something, when I was up in Rochester, I worked for the county executive. We actually had a nuclear facility that was about 15 miles outside of our borders, the Gannett nuclear power plant. We were within that zone, and I actually had to take part in the CMOS exercise. Actually, we'll go with the acronyms again. State Emergency Management Office, as well as with the federal government. It's a very orderly process. When you know what zone you live in, you are given a map showing exactly where you are supposed to go, what bus you're supposed to pick up, where you're going to be, where you're going to actually go. If something happens, you may have to shelter in place. But the fact of the matter is that there will be ample notice that's given. It will be communicated within Westchester. I know you have reverse 911. There are a number of different things. But for the rest of it, I would definitely defer right to the emergency planners.
If I can just briefly respond, I know we want to get to more questions. I think, with all due respect to John, I disagree to some extent. But I want to make sure people understand that only people within the 10-mile radius of Indian Point are going to have the plans, and the plans to evacuate are only applied to this 10-mile area. So I assume we're outside that 10-mile area here. So unless you live within that 10-mile zone, there is no planning for you. So and whether that's good or bad, or whether you think that's important, that's a case. A couple of things on the emergency plans themselves, and I'll let you make your own conclusions. One part of the emergency plan in Westchester County, where I live, is that if there's an accident and evacuation orders, obviously the first part of the population they will try and evacuate are school children that are at school. If an accident happens while they're in school, the idea is they will send extra school buses to the schools to pick up the kids and take them outside the 10-mile radius. Sometimes it's about 11 miles away. They will take them to relocation centers, which are usually 11 to 15 miles outside the 10-mile, so from the plant. So a couple of miles outside the 10-mile zone. The concern is, that we've heard from parents in these areas is, parents are not supposed to go to the school to pick up their kids. They are supposed to trust that the buses will come, get their kids, and take them outside the zone. And the parents are supposed to go to the relocation center and wait for their kids to be brought there. Now, I can tell you, I have stepkids. They're not even my biological kids. If there's an accident, I'm going to run people over to get these kids out of the school. If I think that I'm exaggerating, and I don't mean to make light of that, but I think there's a little disconnect there between what parents, especially of small kids, are going to do to get their kids, and the plan has trouble addressing that because these are plans on paper. It's not like it's dangerous. We don't do mock evacuations because people would get injured doing that. So they do it on paper. They do the best they can with a paper plan, and the people that do this work really tried very hard to make it workable. The people that work for the counties, they don't have the authority to say this plan won't work, we should shut the plant down. Only FEMA and the NRC have that. So, but the basic truth is, if you live here in Larchmont, you're going to see it on the news, but there's no plan to evacuate you here.
Are they going to call Larchmont, Mamaroneck, and tell them, oh, we had an accident?
No, ma'am, they're not.
They're not going to inform outside of the 10 miles?
It would be on the news, but outside the 10 miles, there is no system to inform the public outside of the news and the emergency alert system. I mean, it would be on television, but it might.
No, it'll be on television. It'll definitely be on television. But there's also.
Excuse me. I'm having a problem right now because it's mashed potatoes. There is a 10-mile warning, but we're outside of that 10-mile warning. But we did have a disaster. We did have communication with our police department. We have an egress here in the Boston Post Road. We have the 95 corridor. There will be certain automobiles that will not be on the street. They will make an evacuation to get you out of this area. We have to be very sensible about this. That's mashed potatoes between Lakeland and Mamaroneck High School.
And I'm also going to bring up one important point that I think everyone should recognize. I think it's important that we also understand one thing when we're talking about an evacuation zone. We're talking about a 50-mile zone versus a 10. What we saw what happened in Japan at Fukushima, where they actually asked for a 50-mile zone for Americans, I think it's very important to understand the difference between Fukushima and Indian Point. Fukushima has 6 reactors. It is a very, very large facility. It's not to discount what has happened at Indian Point. Indian Point has 2 reactors. Fukushima had 6. What had happened too, the evacuation zone had actually been implemented as a result of 3 Mile Island. And that was a combination of what had happened between emergency planners, between the federal government. This was what was recommended. The NRC is continuing to look at this. But I would also offer to all of you here, we're also looking at the fact that the plant is operating safely. If the plant is operating in a safe manner, all of you can continue to have confidence that the plant will continue to operate. We have one of the best emergency planners in the entire nation here in Westchester County, and Tony Sutton. And that is his job, is to make sure that all of you here are safe in the event of any emergency. But I think it's important just in terms of looking at what had happened in Fukushima and what's happening here. And when we're talking about a 10-mile zone, Fukushima had 6 reactors, much, much larger, significantly larger than what we have here in Indian Point.
How many do we have?
2.
We got 5 more minutes.
Yeah, the conversation about statistics has taken, to date, has been dealing with either replacement or lowering in terms of rate of efficiencies. But it's taken demand as a constant, as a current constant. Who has done some work on the issue of what's going to happen to demand, let's say over the next 20 years, in terms of increasing population? We're going to end up with about 340 million people, for you people anyway, before you blink an eye, or the various changes in technology, universal health care. What's that going to do to demand in terms of medical equipment, high-speed rail? What will that do to demand? In other words, I don't think we paid enough attention to what's going to happen to demand as we tackle this whole issue.
I think that's a very good point. For the area that we live in here, and for New York City, John mentioned Plan YC. New York City and Mayor Bloomberg, they have done a very good job at actually reducing and flattening out demand in New York City since about 2005. So demand, back in 04, 05, people predicted that New York City's demand was going to go, I think, 2% a year. It's going to increase. That has not happened because he took very aggressive measures on a citywide basis to really reduce it. New York City residents, and I think I have the statistic right, are probably the most energy efficient Americans in the United States, and that's because there are so many of them in a small area. But New York City's, if that's continued to be managed properly, then the demand there is flattened out. I mean, nationwide, absolutely, we have concerns. You know, we all have all these devices that we use. We have, electric cars going on the grid potentially. So I think there are large regional and national energy policies that have to be put in place to address that. And I think I think we make the mistake when we talk about energy efficiency. Part of that, it's not only making buildings and homes and appliances more efficient, but also part of that is just reducing demand. And one very quick thing, I think Con Ed is doing a program the last few years where it's called smart metering, where they can install a meter in your home that actually shows the price fluctuation of energy throughout the day. And so you can look and figure out what, the idea is it encourages you to use energy when it's cheaper. And so that lowers the cost for you, and that lowers energy demand during these peak times. So that's not the whole answer, but that's a great comment, and I think
that also requires cultural change. We'll probably need 3 times as many apartment houses as we have in Westchester and in Rockland and in Putnam if we're going to try to keep demand at the current stage.
One last question. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I just wanted to address the question of who to call in times of any natural disaster or a disaster, God forbid, at Indian Point, you can call United Way's 211 hotline, which serves, I think a lot of you know about 211. 211 is free, confidential, multilingual information, referral, and crisis assistance hotline, serving 7 counties in the Hudson Valley, including, of course, Westchester. And you can reach a live operator between 8 and a call specialist, actually, a highly trained person who can answer your questions. And during times of disaster, the call specialists are in constant touch with authorities from all the different villages and municipalities and emergency personnel from around the entire region. So I would encourage people to keep that in mind. Just dial 211.
Thank you very much for coming. I think you agree our speakers brought a variety of perspectives to the problem. I thought what Nir said probably struck home to all of us, and that is all of us in this room can do more. And if it's our problem to deal with, we can do more to deal with it. Thank you all very much for coming. John, Nir, Philip, thank you. Wonderful panel.